I'm going to get right to my obligations here, pleasant obligation, to introduce our speaker and our interlocutor. I've known Yossi Klein Halevi for probably a half a century. He started in the Soviet Jewry movement when he was 12 years old. That's even much earlier than when I started, and has been a consequential figure on the Jewish scene and beyond for all that time. Yossi has been active in Middle East reconciliation efforts. He is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, a Jerusalem-based research institute and educational center. He's a former contributing editor to the New Republic. He was a senior fellow at the Shalem Center in Jerusalem from 2003 to 2009, and has served as a visiting professor of Israel Studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York some years ago. He is the author of a best-selling book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which I would highly recommend if you haven't read it, and one of the most important thought leaders on the scene today. He will be in conversation this morning with my good friend, our good friend, Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who's the senior rabbi at Valley Beth Shalom in the San Fernando Valley here in Los Angeles. Ed Feinstein is also a rabbinical a teacher at the Ziegler Rabbinical School of American Jewish University, and serves on the faculty of the Wexner program, Heritage program, and the Shalom Hartman Institute. He is a sermonizer extraordinaire and a storyteller beyond peer, and a good friend. So, Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you and to Yossi.
Yossi, Shavua Tov, welcome. It is always an honor to spend time with you, and I regret that it's in such difficult times of crisis and times of pain. But let's begin there. All of us have been watching eagerly every morning, every afternoon, every evening, obsessed with listening to the news, watching what's going on, trying to gain some sense both of the geopolitics of the war in Gaza, and more than that, its effect on the Israeli people. So let's begin there. It's been 8 weeks since the catastrophe. What is the mood in Israel now? What is the feeling? What's on the front page of the newspaper? How are people speaking to each other in the markets, in the streets, in classrooms?
Well, hi, everyone. And, Ed, it's always a pleasure to be with you, and delighted to be back with all of you. Zev, thank you for those warm words. The mood here is grimly determined. The polls show that 90+% of the public, the Jewish public, wants the war to continue until Hamas is brought down. Now, that's extraordinary. So far, there are no anti-war demonstrations. I can't remember another conflict, maybe not since the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. Did we go to war without there being at least some demonstrations from the left, even small symbolic demonstrations? So I think that that's indicative of this consensus, an emotional consensus, that something profoundly different happened to us this time. And it requires a response that's different from any of our other asymmetrical conflicts. You know, we've been fighting asymmetrical wars since 1982, since the first Lebanon War. And all of those conflicts ended inconclusively. And so the mood here is that this asymmetrical conflict, which is probably the most brutal of any of the conflicts we've had until now, this is one asymmetrical conflict that we can't lose. And that's the conversation. But you know what? It isn't actually even a verbal conversation. It's what people take for granted. That's the starting point, the ground. People are still, I think, in a state of shock. I know I am. I don't think I've begun to really process October 7th. And more details are coming out. And there's this tremendous sense of disconnect with the rest of the world, which has moved on to the next phase of the so-called cycle of violence. And that's not where the Israeli public is at all. We're still processing October 7th. We're still talking about what happened. We're still exchanging details. And so that's another component. The hostages, of course, are continuing to rivet the public's attention. We know details, we know the names, the stories, and details are beginning to come out about what the hostages experienced. We only have a small inkling, and I suspect that hostages are not speaking freely because of those left behind, and they don't want to endanger them by revealing too much of how they were treated. But the little that we know is simply appalling. And so we're in this very strange moment here, which I don't recall, where we're traumatized and determined to win at the same time. Morale in the army and on the home front is extraordinary. And if the government tries to prematurely end the war, there will be a public uprising. So this is something, maybe the only time that in some way remotely compares is the Yom Kippur War, which you and I had experienced together as students at Hebrew University. But this is so much more intense because, the Yom Kippur War happened, we didn't really know how bad the situation was until we were already starting to win, at least at the home front.
Right.
And now, of course, we know everything instantly and live. And so and the final piece, I would say, of what we're processing here is the reaction of the progressive West. And that, for all of Israeli cynicism, that has taken the public really by surprise. And it's slowly sinking in that we are increasingly alone. And so there's this sense of being assaulted from in multifaceted ways. We're fighting a war. There are losses at the front. We're finding ourselves pariahs increasingly in large parts of the West. We're still processing the trauma of October 7th. We're still saddled with the worst government in Israel's history. There's so much happening at once that I think we're all in overload. And that's probably true for diaspora Jews as well.
So, there's a very strong halacha, very strong religious imperative that one watches what one says when one visits a house of Shiva. And so I have to ask your forgiveness because I have to ask you some questions that are going to be painful, but I think it's important for us to know. So let's begin with some technical issues. You wrote a column and you've spoken about the conflict between two goals of this war. On the one hand, to destroy Hamas, and at the same time to rebuild the Israeli military deterrence, and the other side to rescue these hostages. Tell us about that conflict, whether those things are congruent and how the Israeli public processes those two.
So what? We've been holding two goals together and assuming that there's no contradiction between them. And those two goals are, as you put it, destroying Hamas and restoring Israeli military credibility, deterrence, and freeing the hostages. What happens, though, if those two goals turn out to be incompatible? Now, there was near total unanimity about the need to free the children and their mothers. And that mission has mostly been completed, not entirely. but mostly. And the public was willing to pay a price for that, including a ceasefire, which clearly allowed Hamas to regroup. And everyone knew that the price of a ceasefire would likely be paid, God forbid, in the lives of soldiers. That was an unspoken given, but we were willing to pay that price to extract the children and the mothers. Now we're in a new phase of the war. Even though not all the children are out, the overwhelming majority are. And the next phase is, what do we do about the need to free the hostages, who are now, for the most part, men, many of them military age, and how much do we compromise the war effort for that? That's an open question. It's an extraordinarily wrenching question. You know, there are these posters all over the streets in Israel, big banners with the little pictures of the hostages, rows and rows of pictures with the words, "Look them in the eye." And the implicit message of that is, if this was your mother, if this was your son, would you have any other consideration? Would you think about the strategic needs of the state to restore its military credibility, or would you put all of your effort into retrieving the hostages? Mm-hmm. And that's a very powerful message. And what worried me was that there would be a deeply divided country when it came down to having to choose. I don't see that happening yet. So far, most of the public seems determined to press on with the war. In fact, when the ceasefire ended, there was a certain amount of relief. I mean, there was this anguish that we hadn't succeeded in retrieving all the children. But at the same time, there was a sense of relief that we're back on track and that the war is continuing. So there's no other issue that could potentially throw a wrench into the national unity aside from the fate of the hostages. But so far, that's not happened.
There was a column over the weekend from Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, who has functioned, I think, and I think others think as well, as a sort of implicit mouthpiece for the Biden administration. And Friedman argued that what Israel should do is offer a complete cessation of hostilities and a withdrawal from Gaza in exchange for the lives of all of the hostages, and let Hamas continue the war if they want to do it. Let them make the choice to continue the war. And part of his argument, and this is where I want to get to, is what's going to happen next? Let's suppose Israel is successful. Let's suppose that, God willing, the hostages are released. Let's suppose that Hamas is destroyed. You know, the sign in the market was, you break it, you keep it. You know, you own it. What happens in Gaza next to Israel? And then also, if we can continue that, what happens next in Israel?
Oh.
Play prophet for a minute, my friend.
Well, let's look at Tom Friedman for a moment, because I think actually that his role has been even more interesting than being the mouthpiece of the Biden administration. I think he's also been an oracle. He was in some cases, he was one step ahead of the administration's positions, which tells us that Biden is paying attention to what he's writing. I think he's really emerged as a senior advisor to Biden on the war. And I think that he's been really interesting. He has by no means been infallible, and I'll give you one example. before the ground offensive began, he warned Israel very solemnly, don't do it, you're walking into a trap.
Mhm.
Well, it turns out, you remember that, right?
Yes.
It turns out there actually was no trap. And what I think he got wrong was that he overestimated Hamas's capabilities, and he also underestimated the extent to which Hamas believed its own propaganda, which is that Israel was finished. We no longer had any fight left in us. And this has been the currency for Hezbollah, for Iran. You know, Iran has these doomsday clocks mounted on street corners that are set to record how many years Israel has left to exist as a state. And I think it was in 2015 that Khamenei, the supreme leader, said that Israel has 25 years left. And so there are these doomsday clocks. And I think that the Islamist front internalized that mindset. And of course, October 7th seemed to confirm that Israel was in complete disarray. But the way we've responded to the war has been very impressive from a professional military perspective. Hamas did not expect this. And so I say that because I think it's important for people to who read Tom Friedman religiously, and I imagine many of the people in this community do, to also read Tom with a little bit of a distance and a little bit of skepticism. Now, I thought not to get to his most recent column, which I thought was very interesting. I have one or two big problems with his approach. And that is, first of all, if you stop the war, you don't resume it. We have mobilized hundreds of thousands of reservists, close to 400,000 reservists. That's an enormous army. You don't simply will that army into existence arbitrarily. And given everything we've experienced with world opinion, I don't think the international community will be passive if we renew a massive war against Hamas in the future. And so this is our opportunity to bring them down. And the final piece of that is, you know, he said that he used the example of the Munich massacres and how Israel systematically hunted down the perpetrators and the planners of the massacre. And he said that we could do the same with Hamas leaders. I think that that's true perhaps for Hamas leaders abroad, but it's not true for Hamas leaders sitting in Gaza, who are sitting in the midst of their population. And so we're going to have the same problem of getting to them in the future that we have now, but at least now we're on the move. We have momentum. And I don't believe the Israeli public would go for it. I think a minority of the public would, but my sense of the mood at this moment, which is that the public wants this war to go on.
So who governs Gaza when this is over?
I think a lot depends on who governs Israel.
Okay, who governs Israel when this is over?
So if this government is still in power, when the war ends, then we'll have chaos in Gaza. This government is incapable of a coherent plan, certainly a coherent plan that would be acceptable, never mind to the international community, to our friends in the US. So my first priority the day after the war is to go back into the streets and resume the protest movement against the government, but this time, I believe, from a place of immeasurably greater rage and determination. You know, the democracy movement in Israel over the last year was something that we hadn't seen before. We hadn't seen that level of determination, persistence, the consistency of these enormous turnouts week after, and it never flagged. We consistently got 200, 300,000 people every week around the country. And I believe that will turn out to be mere prelude compared to the rage that you're going to see in the streets, that we're controlling ourselves now because of the war. But the moment the fighting stops, the momentum will be to bring Netanyahu down. I think that it will take less time, certainly than Netanyahu believes. I think there are going to be defections within the coalition, within the Likud, for that matter, that Netanyahu is keenly aware of. And he believes that, you know, he can pull off one last Houdini-like feat, you know, and slip out of, you remember Houdini's, when he would be immersed underwater, he'd be locked, chained, put in a treasure chest. This is Netanyahu's final Houdini moment in his mind. But I think that the Israeli public knows it's over for him. And the political system knows it too. So we need new elections. We need a reasonable government. It will be right-wing because the country has turned right. Certainly after October 7th, this is an even more right-wing country. But I believe that it's going to be center-right, that the government will contain centrist parties along with right-wing parties. And so I'm very hopeful for the long-term political rehabilitation of Israel. In terms of Gaza, Gaza is not going to be able to wait till we get our house in order. That's clear. So what needs to happen the morning after the fighting stops is some kind of, I would like to see, a regional force in play. My hope, and it may be a forlorn hope, but it is the most tantalizing prospect, which is that the countries of the Abraham Accords adopt Gaza as their first substantive project and bring in the Saudis and concentrate first on economic rehabilitation and then political rehabilitation. Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority is a dead end. I don't often find myself quoting Netanyahu these days, but I do agree with what he said last night at his press conference. It's just about the only thing I agree with that he said, which is that the Palestinian Authority is a dead end and they are not an address for rehabilitating Gaza. I think that that's true. The PA is hopelessly corrupt. It is despised by rank and file Palestinians. It has no legitimacy. It's a fiction. And so what can come in its place if it's not Hamas, if it's not the PA? Gaza may have to be a protectorate of the Arab world. That's certainly along with Israel. That's certainly the direction that I would like to see. But again, Ed, you know, we have a dysfunctional government, and no one here is thinking past the next press conference, you know, the next media event. And certainly Netanyahu is in survival mode. The whole country is in survival mode, but we're in survival mode for the state of Israel. He's in survival mode for the prime minister of Israel. And we're in a complete disconnect.
Let me probe just one more point. So the New York Times published an article this week, a front page article, that indicated that Israel had enormous intelligence that this attack was coming, enormously detailed intelligence. And there's been a report that there were many of the intelligence officers, particularly women, who saw this coming, and they were ignored. This report was ignored. When does that reckoning, first of all, does that count? Does that resonate with the Israeli public? And when does that reckoning come to be?
The reckoning comes the day after the war. It's a dual reckoning with the military echelon and the political echelon. The reckoning with the military will be very quick because there are going to be large numbers of voluntary resignations, almost certainly. They're not going, the top echelon is not going to wait around for the commission of inquiry. They will put the keys on the table and go home very quietly. With Netanyahu, the reckoning will be brutal, and it's going to reopen deep divisions in the country. The difference is that over the last year, the divisions were, let's say, 60% opposed to Netanyahu, 40% in favor. Today, the percentages will be less in Netanyahu's favor, considerably less. There will be a strong majority supporting his ouster. So when you ask about how it's resonating with the Israeli public, I'll use myself as an example, and it's really, I think, indicative of what I see around me as well, which is we don't want to know about that now. The army is performing more than competently, impressively. And that's something none of us could take for granted on October 8th. Given the abysmal performance of the army on October 7th, both obviously in securing the border and in anticipating this attack, and no less in how they handled the actual invasion. It took hours and hours for the army to show up, to organize.
Right.
There are so many questions that are burning in people's minds, but we're deferring them. And we're giving the army the benefit of the doubt. The army is by far still the most trusted institution in Israel.
Still?
Nothing comes close. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the army has acquitted itself impressively now. And it's proven that it's deserved our basic trust. I think that the attitude is they made an enormous mistake, a mistake of arrogance. And there are lots of levels to that mistake, including misogyny, because the people who were warning were almost all women, both in intelligence, and the young soldiers who were sitting on the border watching what's happening on their screens, all of whom were women, and were reporting back saying something is happening. There's something imminent happening. And they were just dismissed along with the women who sounded the alarm in the intelligence community. So there are multiple layers to this reckoning, but for now, the army is fighting. We're with the army. I'll tell you one thing that really impresses me about Yossi Halevi, who's the commander-in-chief, and others of the general staff. These people are carrying an enormous burden of guilt and failure. And they all know that as soon as the war is over, they're out. And yet, when you see the way that they're devoting themselves to winning this war, it's very impressive and very moving. There's something about the quality of these people that's really coming through precisely now when they know that they can't really redeem their reputations. They're not doing it for themselves. They're doing it to try to atone for bringing us to this point. And I'm astonished at their stamina, their emotional stamina. How do they do this? How does Yossi Halevi go out day after day meeting soldiers, getting briefings, making life and death decisions, carrying this enormous weight, knowing how he's going to go down in Israeli history. So I'm full of admiration for him and for the general staff.
Let's keep on current events for just one more moment and turn your attention to the West Bank. While all of this catastrophe is happening in and around Gaza, and of course in the cities of Israel, what's going on in the West Bank? What's going on with settlers and settler violence? And what's going on with the radicalization or not of the population on the West Bank?
Well, one of the problems is that the Israeli public doesn't know what's happening. It's being drastically underreported here. Everyone's focus is on Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big mistake. We're going to pay a price for that. And I need, as an Israeli citizen, I need our American friends to apply heat to the government, to pay attention to settler violence, to make sure that the Shabak, the Shin Bet, is doing everything it can. And I imagine they're trying to tamper down settler violence. But the fact that it's not on our radar is indicative of both the obsessiveness of the public on the war and the short-sightedness of the public, to say nothing of the government. Look, the most extreme settlers have their political patrons sitting in the heart of this government. And so political pressure by our friends, by the American Jewish community, on the government, to make sure that settler violence, first of all, for the most pragmatic reasons, to make sure that settler violence doesn't undermine the credibility of the Gaza war, which, as we all know, is under the credibility of that war is already under massive assault. And settler violence is a tremendous danger to our ability to continue to hold American support. So that message needs to be conveyed very clearly to the Israeli government.
I wonder if I could ask you a sort of Shabbos question, which is to step away for a moment from the immediacy of this. I know it's very difficult, but and to think about a sort of a bigger picture for a minute. You just think about what Israel's gone through over the last several years. You know, you have 5 elections in 3 years, the fourth of which brought about, brought a coalition government that was kind of remarkable in its breadth and included Arab parties for the first time. The 5th election brought Netanyahu back into power with the far right, which was also unthinkable in Israeli politics. Then you had almost an entire year of hundreds of thousands of people in the street protesting in favor of democracy against the judicial coup. And now you have the October 7th catastrophe. The question is, how much stress can one put on a social fabric before it breaks? How much stress can you put on a population, on a political system before it breaks?
This was by far the worst year in Israel's history, which is saying something. That's
right,
really
exactly.
It's an achievement.
Yes.
And the Netanyahu government presented us with 2 images, 2 scenarios of the unraveling of Israel. The first scenario was an internal unraveling, and that was playing out over the last year. The second scenario was an external unraveling, and that played out on October 7th. That's what the destruction of Israel would look like if we were attacked and responded with complete chaos. So what the public is processing now are these 2 overwhelming images, overwhelming scenarios of what the end of Israel would look like. Either of those would be such a shock to the system that it would take us years to recover from. I think that the Israeli public has shown a remarkable degree of resilience. And the fact that the government went AWOL, not only on October 7th, but in the critical weeks afterwards, in terms of taking care of the home front, in terms of taking care of the evacuees from the Gaza border, from the northern border. The protest movement, the democracy movement, stepped in where the government services were failing and mobilized the public to donate massive amounts of clothing and food, and even took care of psychological counseling for the survivors of the massacre. That should have been done by the government. So I'm bringing this out to show that the Israeli public has remarkable reserves, tremendous strength in this society. But there certainly are limits to what a society can take before it starts to crack. I don't know if the cracks are going to be expressed politically. I'm worried about a further rise in the far right after this. I think that to some extent that's inevitable, especially among young people. October 7th is the formative event for a whole generation now that's instantly come of age. And I don't think the far right is the future of Israel. I think the mainstream of Israeli society craves healing more than anything else. And I think that's going to result in, and the polls show this, in a rise of a center-right coalition. But psychologically, this is a country that we've got layers of unresolved trauma that accumulate. And that's really the history of the Jewish people in the last 100 years. But in Israel, it happens intensively. And now this is a historic trauma. This isn't, this is the second Intifada, but far, far greater. And the consequences of the second Intifada were enormous. Politically, it destroyed the Israeli left. Culturally, it brought a strong rise of spiritual search among secular Israelis. It strengthened the role of Jewish identity in the states. What this will bring, I guess it also depends how the war ends. It depends if the war spreads to the northern front and we find ourselves in a regional conflict against the entire Shiite Iranian arc, which I think is a real possibility. And then we're talking about a completely different kind of war, a massive assault on the Israeli home front, tens of thousands of missiles fired from Lebanon, from Syria, from Iran itself. And so in some sense, I don't think the trauma has nearly played itself out yet. And the Israeli public knows that. We know what could be coming. And I think that we'll hold together. I think we'll be able to respond coherently and effectively with an enormous psychological toll.
So I don't mean to press on the wound, but I want to ask one more question about this. So in the 70s, I would think it was 76 or 77, there was a popular song in Israel that said, Kol ha'olam negdenu. The whole world is against us. And I can't help but imagine that Israelis are also watching the way the international community, the world, is responding. And when you see hundreds of thousands of pro-Hamas demonstrators in capitals in London and elsewhere, how do Israelis respond? And how does a social fabric process that reality?
You know, it's interesting. When you were mentioning that song, I was thinking that, is there another country in the world that would have a popular song with those lyrics? You know? And the funny thing about that song is it's a very upbeat tune.
Yes.
Yeah, the whole world is against us, but we got through worse. We'll get through this too, you know, the Israeli kind of bravado. And this time, there are no songs about the world being against us. There's no sense of, oh yeah, that's okay. We know we can get through this. I think the public is in deep shock. And, you know, it bears reminding ourselves that Israel is losing the public relations war to Hamas. It's a stunning moment. And that the slogan that has now been released into the mainstream of the West is a genocidal slogan, from the river to the sea. And it became popular at precisely the moment when Hamas gave us a glimpse of what from the river to the sea would look like. A genocidal pre-enactment of one big happy Palestinian state in which the Jews are helpless. And so it's an astonishing moment. And Israelis are struggling to understand this. And, you know, there is one category in which we tend to fit international hostility, which is anti-Semitism, which is traditional hostility to Jews. I think that there's another category that maybe more sophisticated Israelis are struggling with, which is, what does this tell us about the moral condition of the West? That ultimately this is not about Israel. It's about the West. It's about a generation that's coming of age on campuses where the cause of choice is the regime that brought us October 7th. And so I think that that's also becoming part of the conversation, is this sober realization of fear that this is a symptom of a serious moral decline of the West. And in the past, Israelis would confine that speculation to Europe. But now America is front and center in Israeli anxiety about the future of the West. So what I'm trying to say is that Israelis are reacting in two ways: in a traditional Jewish response mechanism. They hated us. They always hated us. They always will hate us. And this is telling us something essential about the West that we need to pay attention to.
So again, let's pursue this. At the risk of giving away too much, over the summer, you previewed for many of us in a seminar a book that you're writing about Zionism, and why it was that Zionism was embraced so enthusiastically by Jews after the Holocaust, coming from your own background and coming from with a view to that generation. And it seems to me that October 7th has brought back so many ghosts, so many specters. The Jew is pariah, the Jew lonely in the world, the Jew is helpless, the Jew who is made victim of made criminal culpability for his own victimhood. So many of the tropes of our history that Zionism managed to shove away create a zone of a different kind of Jew, a different kind of Jewishness in the world, this moment has seemed to have brought back to life again. I know that's happening here. People who otherwise feel very comfortable in America are telling me how lonely they feel, how abandoned.
Yeah. I think that the temptation to evoke a Holocaust analogy is understandable. I'm not comfortable with that. It's understandable because Jews died en masse in a state of helplessness and in grotesque ways. It's also understandable because of this feeling of aloneness. I'm not comfortable though with Holocaust analogies. First of all, because I don't like opening that door to trivializing the Holocaust. And I much prefer analogies that are homegrown, that are part of the Middle East, part of the region that we belong to, because this is a Middle Eastern event more than a European event. And if there are any analogies that I think should be applied, it's ISIS. That really seems to me a reasonable analogy. And the other reason why I don't like opening up the door to Holocaust analogies is because that's a double-edged sword. When we're the target of mass casualties, then we evoke the Holocaust. But as we see happening in Gaza with the enormous civilian casualties, which is something, Ed, we should really talk about before we wind down. When we see the enormous suffering in Gaza, the temptation is around the world, and it's certainly happening, to simply switch the Holocaust analogy from our side to their side. And this is not a competition for victimhood. Mm-hmm. Israelis don't want to win the victimhood sweepstakes. What we're doing in Gaza is not how a victim behaves. And we're giving better than we got. And that's very much part of the Israeli consensus as well. But when you have power and you use that power, and there are terrible consequences in human suffering for that power, then you should be very careful about evoking Holocaust imagery to try to defend yourself, explain yourself. My defense for this war is very simply that no country can tolerate a genocidal regime that has already proven its genocidal capabilities and has every intention of continuing in that direction, to remain on its border. That's simply untenable. And so I'm not apologizing for using our power. I'm heartbroken by the devastation. And I know that there's a moral burden to pay. You can call it karma, call it whatever category, whatever language you're comfortable with. But I believe very strongly in karma, and I believe that there are moral debts that need to be worked out. And we are accumulating moral debts. I believe we have no choice. I'm sure there are ways in which the war could be more effectively fought without as many civilian casualties, but I don't think that it would be appreciably different in all truth. I think that given the conditions in Gaza, given the goal of the IDF to bring the Hamas regime down, this is a recipe for a humanitarian catastrophe that's playing out. And I don't want to stop the war at all, not for a moment. But it also means that I have to bear the moral consequences of the devastation.
Is there a sense of satisfaction within the Israeli public that the army is doing all that it can do to limit civilian casualties, or is there a sense of like the accusations have been made that there's a bit of callousness, there's a degree of callousness out of a sense of revenge.
Look, there's no question that the rules of engagement have been loosened. And Israeli policymakers will justify that in the framework of international law. International law stipulates that proportionality is determined by its relationship to the threat that you face and to your military objectives. And by those measures, Israel can't afford the kind of painstaking knocking on the roof, warnings, or long deliberations in selecting each target. This is a war to bring down a genocidal regime, and that has different rules of engagement. And yes, it's true that the rules, the constraints have been loosened, but I wouldn't say that revenge is the main motive. I think the main motive is strategic, and that is that if you're going to bring down Hamas, they cannot use the immunity of their human shields. They can't use the immunity of schools and mosques and hospitals. We're going to go in everywhere that we think they're in. We're going to give people time to evacuate, which we've done and we're continuing to do. And I think that is probably the most that we can do under these circumstances. And the other thing that I want to say about civilian casualties is the numbers that are thrown around are simply ludicrous. And they're ludicrous for two reasons. One is that, or three reasons. The first is that they come from Hamas and they're being treated uncritically. And we know, we had the first warning with the hospital when the war began. And New York Times banner headline on its website, 500 Palestinians reported dead, Israel accused, Israel to blame, says Hamas, right? Now, I looked at that as a former journalist. I saw that headline an hour after the attack. I said, a missile has just hit a hospital and Hamas knows that there were 500 casualties. Do you know how long it would take to do a body count in a building that was hit by a missile? That's work for days. And under these conditions of intensive war, Hamas is able to come up with a body count of 15,000, and the foreign media, the international media buys it, uses that figure uncritically. That's the first problem. The second problem is that whatever figure Hamas comes up with does not include Hamas terrorists. Israel's estimate, and it's a very rough estimate, we could also play the game of rough estimates, is that we've killed 5,000 Hamas terrorists so far. 5,000, 7,000, 3,000. The point is we've killed a lot, and that doesn't get factored in to whatever number the media has adopted from Hamas. And so when you look at all of these factors, there's something just absurd about the body count. Now, of course, the body count is very high, very painful. The suffering is profound, but there's this recklessness and this willingness to adopt Hamas's statistics, along with widespread credibility, widespread doubts about what happened on October 7th. That's an open question, but Hamas's 15,000 civilian casualties is a closed subject.
I don't think you'll get much argument from us, from all of us who have spent the last 8 weeks shouting at our radios and our televisions. Certainly not in my home, where we do a great deal of shouting at the television and at the radio. Yossi, in the last moment or two, I want to ask you for a little wisdom and a little hope. God willing, the war will be successful and come to an end. Hamas will be expelled. God willing, hostages will be returned, many of them, God willing. God willing, soldiers will be decommissioned, will be demobilized, will return to civilian life, no doubt, bearing the trauma of battle. And Israeli society is going to bear the trauma of this event for a very, very long time. Governments will change, no doubt, but there'll be a deep impact on the society. Again, you and I began our time together during Yom Kippur. You went to Israel to create Israel, and I came to America to play rabbi here. How do we heal? How does the Jewish people heal? How does the state of Israel heal? What can we have always had a talent as a people of drawing strength and wisdom and initiative out of trauma. What can we draw out of this trauma that might actually prepare us for a longer future? Give me a little hope.
I have to tell you, Ed, and this may sound totally counterintuitive, but I actually feel far more hopeful post-October 7th about Israel's future than I did over the last year, pre-October 7th. Over the last year, I felt the country was disintegrating from within. We were losing our moral foundation, our decency. And I didn't know if liberal Israel would have a place in the new Israel that this government was trying to create in its image, a nightmare Israel. And when you're being threatened from within, you don't know how to cope. When the threat is coming from your own government, I mean, in America, you've had some experience with that. But in Israel, that's something we really can't afford that. And so I was fighting almost a clinical depression over the last year. That vanished on October 8th. Instead of depression, I went into trauma. but that's different. That's different. That's, we know how to deal with external threat. The fact that this country came together, that we were able to instantly pivot from the lowest point in our national cohesiveness in our 75-year history to one of the peak moments of solidarity, literally overnight, gives me enormous hope for Israel. We've rediscovered our basic commonality. We've rediscovered our capacity to fight together, to die together if necessary, to sacrifice together. It's an extraordinary self-revelation and enormously reassuring. So there's that. Obviously, there will be no healing until there's a change of government. And the government we need needs to reflect as broad a spectrum of Israeli society as possible, including hopefully Arab Israelis, which was the great success, the breakthrough of the Bennett government that preceded this coalition. And so I think that we're really going to enter a period of national healing where we're going to start asking ourselves some very hard questions. And one of those questions is, how did we allow ourselves to get to the point where we seem to be on the verge of some kind of civil war? How did we allow that to happen when there's so much basic sense of solidarity just waiting to be tapped? And so there's going to be a very deep self-reckoning in Israeli society. And I see the emergence of new leaders, young leaders coming out of this trauma. I think that there are going to be movements for Israel's spiritual renewal coming from all kinds of directions, political, cultural, religious. What was cannot be. Now, obviously, what was, there is a large part of Israel that wants what was. But they're a minority now. They're very much a minority, a substantial minority, but a majority of this country wants to figure out a new way of how we relate to each other. And my hope also extends to the region, because we have an opportunity to renew the Abraham Accords, to bring in the Saudis, and eventually to take this new configuration and apply it to the Palestinian tragedy. The Palestinian tragedy can only be solved regionally. It's not going to be solved bilaterally in negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and it's not going to be solved by the international community. It is a regional problem that requires a regional solution. And one last point here that I think is really important to emphasize, and this is something you will not see in your media, and that is that the future of Israel's relations with the Arab world depends on us winning this war. For a very simple reason. The countries of the Abraham Accords turned to Israel because of our power. They need a strong Israel. The Saudis will not make peace with us if we are perceived to be weak. If we can't defeat Hamas, if we allow Hamas, the weakest of our enemies, to prevail, I don't believe we will have peace with the Saudis. And so this is something that, again, is counterintuitive for most people in the West. They assume we're going to be alienating the Arab world. Quite the opposite. And I also think, by the way, that the argument that we hear over and over again, that we're radicalizing a new generation of Palestinians, well, the opposite process may actually also be taking effect. Many Palestinians might be asking themselves, is it really worth it? Look where Hamas has brought us time and time again. Just when we think we're going to win, we get this disaster. What radicalizes Palestinians and what radicalizes parts of the Muslim world is not Israel winning, but Israel losing. Look at the radicalization that happened on October 8th throughout the Muslim world. Look at the celebrations, the sense of imminent victory. The Zionists are about to be destroyed. That's what Israel's weakness encourages radicalization, not Israel's strength.